So I think I was saying I put together this material to kind of bring these two worlds together. So you have the more technical world of phytochemistry and herbal constituents. That's, more like for science geeks. And then over here you have herbalists who could benefit from this information. But it needs to be explained in our own language. So I'm I've got a foot in two worlds. I've trained in chemistry quite a bit, biological sciences. But I started out as an herbalist way back in 1986, doing wise woman tradition herbalism, and, spent a lot of time in the southern Appalachians, wildcrafting, being a village herbalist and that kind of thing. And then I actually went back to college when I graduated when I was 40 years old. So after doing the herbalist thing for, quite some time, I decided to go back and restudy the chemistry and then bring the two of those together to see how that could really empower the practice of herbalism to bring this phytochemistry stuff back into it. So one of the things on these slides I put together, which now I can't see because out here in Ye Boonies, apparently phones and computers can't work together. So anyway, yeah. So, but I put some cannabis up there as an example because, it's really interesting, like the way people think about this plant has been pigeonholed into basically, first it was THC and now it's CBD and THC, and those are the kinds of constituents that we call cannabinoids. But as an herbalist, the way we extract a plant has a big influence on the types of constituents and therefore the types of medicinal actions that we are pulling out of it. So, when we start to look at this plant, it's a really good example of how do you approach something like this as an herbalist. How do you learn, what are the molecules in there? What do we know about their activities? And then what do we know about the synergistic interactions between them, which is really huge. Because that's, one of the big things that makes a medicinal plant different from a pharmaceutical is the fact that inside a medicinal plant you've got hundreds or even thousands of biologically active phytochemicals, right? And they're all influencing each other. So some of them are working together to strengthen, in effect. Some of them are actually kind of working to modify each other or counterbalance in effect. So it's a very complex entity, a living herb, and we have to approach it differently and think about it with a totally different mindset than, we would think about single molecule pharmaceuticals. So understanding some things about what's in a plant like cannabis or any other medicinal plant, and then what features of which molecules we want to pull out or extract and put into our medicinal products, and, what we understand about the complexity of a living biological medicine. And, how do we address that with our extractions and our medicine making? So those are the kind of questions that this kind of stuff can answer. That's just one set of questions. So that's what I put up there. So, I'm almost an old hippie. I was born in 1960, so, I was one of those 9-year-old hippie wannabes during the Summer of Love, and back then, basically people's understanding of cannabis was this is something you smoke to get high, right? And so the focus zoomed in on THC, basically, and for a long time that's the only molecular thing you ever heard about this plant. But as it turns out, and as a lot of us probably know, this is a very traditional herbal medicine going back thousands of years. There's evidence for it being used, and it's been prepared in a lot of different ways, and that didn't even involve burning the herb. So different sorts of extractions, what happens if you make a traditional herbalist style water extraction of, say, the dried leaves of this plant? What sort of medicine are you getting in that, and what are its features? What if you extract it in a sort of like you would make an herbal infused oil, but you use coconut oil? Say, what sort of features do you bring that out? What effect does heat have on it? Raw versus what we call decarboxylated is a big difference, because that the amount of heat that you use to extract certain compounds from this plant influences basically their bioavailability, or how well and how rapidly they're taken in to the system. and even how they're distributed, and, you know, whether or not they go to your liver first or they go to your brain or whatever. It all depends on how you ingest something. So kind of understanding how those phytochemicals move through the body and are processed by the body, and how, you know, that affects the activities that we receive from them. So that also depends on the kind of medicines you make and your, you know, your extraction approaches to the plants. So, so there's a lot of different things. One thing that I got really fascinated with this plant is how did the pharmacists in America prepare it as a medication once it was in the, when was it, like around the 1860s, I believe, that it came in the 1870s, that it came into use as a botanical medicine that the pharmacists and the physicians in this country would, it was just another one of their, quote, drugs. You know, like all the herbs used to be called drugs because they were. And chemical medicine was, you know, entering the scene at that point, but most herbal medicines back then were considered to be, you know, just another kind of drug. So how was that prepared by the professionals back then, right? So we have these old information sources from those days, including the old pharmacopoeias, so the old USPs, and we have, oh, is my timer going off? Let me stop that. Can everybody still hear me okay? Hello, world?
Yes.
Yes?
I think everybody can hear you great, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And so in the old pharmacopoeias, the old USPs, there are specific directions about how to prepare this plant. And then you would have the working handbooks, the pharmacist's working handbooks, which were called the formularies. They kind of went hand in hand with the USPs. They're sort of like the books of standards. So they have all these instructions about, you know, how as a professional pharmacist you would prepare this plant. And interestingly, it turns out that they were, you know, doing percolations, basically, like we do with a lot of our herbs, but with some very, you know, specific nuances that would make it work with the very resonance herb. So I studied that for quite a bit, and it's really interesting because, you know, this kind of studying herbal constituents and phytochemistry gives you the ability to really, like, refine and tailor your medicine making to each individual plant, right? So, like, when we start out learning how to tincture, for example, when I started out learning, it was 100 proof vodka, right? Just something you could get, which is 50% water, 50% ethanol. So it's like middle of the road, you know, hit your extraction right down the middle. You're going to get a pretty good array of constituents. But if you've ever, like, you know, gone into an apothecary or health food store and looked at like Gaia Herbs or Herb Farm, those tinctures that are widely distributed, and you look at each different one on the bottle, you ever notice that there's different alcohol percentages? And they're very specific, too. You know, it'll be like some herb, it'll be like 38 to 42%. You ever wonder what that's about, right? So what they're doing is they're adjusting their extraction menstruum, right, or solvent system, as we call that, a hydroethanolic solvent system, right, water and ethanol. By adjusting the proportions of alcohol and water in there, they're targeting that solvent to particular molecules in a particular plant, right, so that solvent is pulling those molecules out, and it's featuring those molecules, and it's featuring the activities of those molecules. So you can really, like, zoom in with your extraction methods to get particular things out of plants, or, on the other hand, to avoid particular things, right? So understanding some basic underlying chemistry principles really helps you grasp that, and it really gives you tools to increase the, you know, the concentration and the potency and the efficacy of your herbal medicine. So some people like to take this class that we put together because they're really interested in medicine making, refining their medicine making skills. And then there's, you know, there's a fair bit of clinical information in it as well, because, as you probably know, I'm the director of the Colorado School of Clinical Herbalism, so we have a clinical focus. So it's, it's chemistry in the service of clinical herbalism. And so I put a lot of stuff in the context of like, well, that's fascinating, but what can we actually do with that? Like, what does that tell us about how to use this plant, or even about how to formulate, right? So how to combine, different herbs in a formula so that they'll be compatible with each other, so they won't like gum up or precipitate and have constituents fall out of solution and end up as sludge on the bottom of the bottle. So it plays into the whole formulation thing as well. And then, it helps you understand your herbs on a really deep inside kind of level. So a lot of people will take my class because they've been practicing herbalism for years, and chemistry is like, one of those things that we know it's important, but ick, because they had some horrible encounter with some chemistry teacher in high school or college, and they made it super hard and hard to understand, and there's a lot of gnarly math, and that's the kind of thing I don't like to do. So, I like to remind people that herbal constituents and phytochemistry, this is something that the plants are actually doing. This is something plants invented, right? Like, plants are the master pharmacists of our planet. They do crazy things. Like, they can't, they stand there rooted in the ground, dealing with everything that comes to them. They can't get up and run away from the grasshoppers, so they make chemicals to make the grasshoppers run away from them. Or like they're out there sitting in the sun, and it's super hot, and ultraviolet radiation is pouring down on them. They can't put on some sunglasses and a hat and go sit in the shade. They have to deal with that situation by adjusting what they're doing chemically, right? So they make, sunscreen basically for themselves, antioxidants, flavonoids, and stuff like that. So, I like to remind people that, when we start talking about chemistry, some people's eyes just glaze over because they're like, oh, that's that terrible stuff they tortured us with in school. But actually, it's not. It's what the plants are doing inside. It's almost mystical to me because it's like another level of understanding these actions, right? So you get to kind of go down the rabbit hole and see how the plants are pulling off these. Here's a mucilaginous plant. It's cooling, it's soothing, it's relaxant, it's antispasmodic, whatever. You kind of see how the plant is doing that with, I don't know, it's like, to me, phytochemicals are plant spirits. It's a very different way to look at it. But they're these energetic entities that carry information, really, and they carry that information into our bodies in the form of constituents, and that information communicates, with our molecules and brings about some sort of physiological change. So I kind of like to look at it as an information transfer process also, which is an interesting way to go about that. So here's another cool thing you can learn from studying herbal constituents is, just as I brought up the whole mucilaginous thing, you can sort of start categorizing your herbal medicines by their actions, constituent-based actions, rather than by this plant is good for that condition, right? So we have this thing that I tend to look at it as kind of like allopathic herbalism, like drug substitution, right? So you're like, okay, aspirin is good for a headache, so therefore, willow bark is good for a headache. And that's a paradigm of thought that we've been trained into in our society. But if you kind of switch out of that way of thinking and start really looking at the actions of the herbs and their constituents and how they're affecting the body, then you can start getting sort of some therapeutic categories together based on constituents. So say you need, a mucilaginous herb to soothe inflammation in the gut lining. Then you can start thinking about, okay, so I know mucilages are water-soluble, heteropolysaccharides, and they're featured in this array of plants. So we could use slippery elm, or we could use Siberian elm, or we could use, rose hips, or we could use marshmallow, or we could use, whatever endless list of herbs that feature water-soluble heteropolysaccharides. We know that they all have this kind of mucosal soothing activity, and most of them are immunomodulatory as well. So you start getting like another way to look at your therapeutics and another kind of more flexibility in which sorts of plants you might think of using with which sorts of situations. So that's where the herbal constituents information becomes, really clinical and applicable. So, it tends to make us think maybe it's very abstract and not very important, but when you get a facility with it, it really does inform the actual practice of herbal medicine, not just of medicine making, which is important, but also of, applying what you know to formulation and to clinical situations. And it even helps you to some degree to understand matching herbs with people's constitutions and energetics also, which is really interesting. So that's kind of the big picture of what it's about, what I'm teaching here. And I guess it's to take some questions. How do we do that, Sam? If people have things they want to ask me?
Yeah, if they do, I'll see them because I'm online and I've been advancing your slides here. So as you've been talking, so I think it's worked out pretty well.
Okay, did I leave anything out?
No, it's been great. That's great. I wanted to add just briefly too to folks that have been studying with me and in our clinical program, you should be able to see that there's a vast overlap here between the pathophysiology modules that we go through. When I go through, the key, I always go through what are the key points that we're looking at when we're formulating. And it's never, like Lisa said, it's never, well, this herb's good for that. It's never, well, the salicylic acid is good for headaches. It's always, what is the tissue that we're working with and what is the action that our herbs have on the tissue. So first we figure out, and at a cellular level, that's what we have to do at the cellular level, because we have different kinds of cells and different kinds of tissues throughout our body, and we have different terms that describe, the tissues that are specific to that organ, actually the organ's functionality, versus other types of, parenchymal cells that are around and are not necessarily part of that organ's function. And those functional cells and the relationship between those and our constituents is where we start to be able to draw these, these lines of kind of connection between not just the plants and our organ systems, but also between groups of plants and species within a genus and even sometimes within an entire family, these commonalities that just make you so much more of a potent herbalist and a clinician because of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's what's so much fun about what I'm doing now because, I get to go down the herbal constituents rabbit hole. And then when I come into school here, I'm one of the main physiology teachers, and we're doing our fundamentals program right now. And, I'll just start going off about this physiology, and then there's these moments where those two worlds just come together. They totally inform each other. And, you just kind of want to smack yourself in the head sometimes. You'd be like, oh, my God, it's so brilliant. Like, this herb presents, like, these 5 sets of constituents with these 5 actions, and here's how it interacts with, like, kidney tissue, and that's how that affects, inflammatory states, and, and focusing on that organ and these tissues. And it's just super fascinating when you can look at the body and the plants in that kind of detail together. And really, understand how they influence each other. And like I said, how that information is being transferred between the plant and the human body. And it's almost like when you get to that level with these things, the divisions between plant and human really blur. We always have these things like, yes, all is one, nature is all one, biology is one big thing, life power moves through everything. And you can see that when you look at it on a molecular and cellular level with how the plant constituents are influencing, or as Simon Mills would say, nudging the human physiology. So it's pretty profound that way. I mean, I'm always like segueing in and out between like this crazy technical chemical detail perception and this big picture, like the unified life power perception.
That's exactly it. I mean, that I think that hits the nail on the head. That's what the consummate herbalist, Western herbalist, in my opinion, should be able to do, is to float between the vitalistic side, right, and then the reductionist side. And not be trapped in one or the other, because neither one is really the answer all by itself. And those are just two facets, maybe on a multifaceted, paradigm of many different things that could work. But those particular two are particularly vexing for us in the West because, and for Western herbalism and Western thought in general, as we go down the road comparing, and it's always been East versus West. When I was growing up, and I'm about the same age as you, and I was growing up, and I was fascinated by Eastern philosophy and Taoism, martial arts, and it was always East versus West. And then that kind of grew in herbalism to me, to being able to say, well, I studied, physiology and pathophysiology, through my journey in medicine to begin with. And then I came around, with this kind of intuitive love, growing up in a plant literate family. And now the two things really merge to where you can say, from taking your class, a person can understand there are specific reasons why, if you take, let's just, like, what's your administration of this herb? What if you take it sublingually? What's the molecular size need to be? What's the polarity need to be able to get these constituents across there? Because we know they aren't going to go across the brush border. For instance, berberine is a great example. We're not going to get any of it across the brush border. Can we get it across if we do it sublingually? Can we do it if we use a respiratory? If we actually nebulize it, will it get across? And what are the answers to that? Or the thyroid is a great one. There's just so much misunderstanding on the herbalism side about thyroid, and people just throw these herbs at it. Well, take some ashwagandha and some Iberian ginseng, and nobody really knows what's going on. What's going on is you have to study, the actual cells of the follicular cells of the thyroid. You have to understand a little bit about the hypothalamus. You have to understand a little bit about the pituitary, in particular the anterior pituitary, which leads you then to the physiology of where did that come from. If you look at the embryology of the human being, the anterior pituitary really was part of the back of the nose, of the nasal sinus area. So if you can apply the herb across the sinuses, say in a neti pot or a nausea oil, or even a snuff, to get it to there, does that mean that you're going to be able to affect, for instance, an anterior pituitary issue that's related to part of the entire communication system of the thyroid? I mean, all of these are questions that I think you can start asking once you've studied the constituents, once you've studied the chemistry and the phytochemistry, and once you've studied and that's led you down the road to the physiology of the body. You can't take each one apart individually. You have to be good at all of them, I think. You have to be a generalist about how you apply these.
I totally agree with that. And it's super fascinating because the physiomedicalists, which I'm really into physiomedicalists, so we're talking, William Cook was the most famous of those. I think his first big work was published in 1869, I think. And, he was a consummate herbalist, he was a wildcrafter, he was a botanist, he was a physician, he wrote tons of everything. He ran a medical school. He was just one of these genius people. And, when I first started reading his work, I was like, what on earth is this man talking about? Number one, it's archaic language, granted. It's from the 1869. But, some of the language that he used in there took me a long time to wrap my brain around, because it was really focused on I guess, it's hard to translate some of it. It really focused on the energetics on tissue states. With Western herbalism talked a lot about that. And they didn't, he was a chemist, a pharmacist, and he was really interested in, how do I extract an herb in the best way possible so that it has the maximum influence, like whatever influence they wanted, like tonic astringent influence on the mucous membranes, which are in a state of over-relaxation, And so I've been studying his work for, 5 or 6 or 7 years now, and it's finally coming together with the phytochemistry, because, the example you were using, like berberine, he wouldn't say, berberine is an antibiotic, which it isn't really, or he would say, it's a topical antiseptic tonic astringent with particular affinity for the mucous membranes. And then I can take that, like profound clinical understanding, and I can tie that right down to the constituents that are in that plant. And, okay, here we have the pseudoberberine type alkaloids, we have berberine, and we have hydrastine, and hydrastine is particularly associated with this tonic astringent effect on the mucous membranes, but it's not water soluble to any appreciable degree, whereas berberine is. So if you want to get the maximum combination of these, you have to look at the different plants and the different plant parts, and you can just go on and on like that, tying these worlds together. And that kind of approach to it really, shows you how phytochemistry can make you a better practitioner, basically. So,
yes.
I love it.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to be able to delve in all the way in, and then to the reductionism, and then come all the way back out and look at the big picture. And that's part of what I really love about your brand of herbalism and who you are, Lisa. And I always, people already probably know this, but this is part of why I think our schools work so well together. I mean, I remember talking to Paul Bergner about this. I was like, man, there's just like there's really a synchronicity going on here. That's it's like we're kind of two different things and have two different approaches, and yet we're very, very similar, I think, in how we do things. So I'm just so thrilled that you're giving this class. And I think it's such a wonderful class.
Yeah, I want to take all your classes. I want to go to your school, Sam. That's my perpetual conundrum. It's like, I want to be a student at your school and at my school. But, oh, wait. I'm administrating. Yeah. But, that's why herbalism is so interesting. It's like this endless thing, It's like one of those things. It's like the more you learn about it, the bigger it gets, and you realize, you answer one question and it leads you on to 20 more, and then you go down that rabbit hole. And, to me, it's just endlessly fascinating. Like, I get bored easily because I have, like, a brain like that, but I never get bored with herbalism. There's always, like, some new fascination to pursue. So,
yes.
Yay.
Yes. I thank you, Lisa. There's a question that actually came in. Rick says, Sam, Lisa, what are the prerequisites for the course? Is it it's master's level, so I'm assuming it requires slightly more robust knowledge of herbs. Do you want to answer that?
Right. So for the herbal constituents, actually the main requirement is curiosity and open-mindedness and the ability to read slowly and comprehend what you're reading. So it was really interesting when we launched this course last year. We had the most amazing variety of people sign up for it. From people who have been practicing herbalism for a long time, and their last encounter with chemistry was that horrible class I took in high school. Do you think I'll be able to take this class? And I'm like, give it a try, So there are technicalities and specific language, targeted terminology and stuff like that. But you do not need to have, an undergraduate degree. You don't need to have formal studies in science. I have designed it for, not necessarily the very beginning herbalist, but for somebody who's been doing some medicine making or has a clinical practice. We even had like nurses, like pharmacists, physicians who've taken this course. So it's across the board, like, okay, it is nerdier than a lot of experiences, but, part of my goal with it is to bring this to practicing herbalists, practicing medicine makers, to give you a new tool set, right? So I've tried to, focus it on not necessarily on people who like chemistry or who have studied chemistry already. So it's definitely like 99% math free, and it's in the language of herbalism. For the most part. So I encourage people to give it a try. If you think, maybe I can do this, then you probably will be fine. If you're the kind of person that's like, I only want to talk to plant spirits, I have no interest in this whatsoever, I hate chemistry, then maybe it's not, especially for you. But it's, calling it master's level is kind of interesting because that sets us up to think like, I have to have undergraduate studies in this topic already, which is totally not true. So, it's hard to be everything for everybody, but I've tried to make it as broadly appealing as possible by keeping it in the context of herbs that we, are familiar with and clinical practice.
Yeah, and if you get on the free, we have that free course. There's some lectures by Lisa there that you can see that Lisa is kind of the walking, talking exemplar of that saying, I think, that's attributed to Albert Einstein, that you do not fully understand a subject unless you can explain it to your grandmother. And Lisa's really good at that. She can explain the most complex concepts, literally, to your grandmother. So it works.
Right. I love that. Oh, thank you, Albert. That's great. So, do we have any more questions lined up?
I think that's it. Bryony says she took the free course and thought it was amazing. She couldn't get enough of it.
Awesome.
Got a lot of good stuff. Yeah. She has one
Yeah.
question too. One question coming in.
Okay.
Brent also. Oh, Katia's here. Great. It's up on this. Oh, Bryony says it's up on the slide. Your question is up on the slide? I'm missing something. About CBD. Oh, okay. So let's go back. With this slide, Bryony, which one are you talking about? The cannabis one or the one after? The phytochemistry one on cannabis? I'll just leave it here. She's typing right now. Tuba, switches link. What should be teaching? Oh, Bryony wants to know if you'll be teaching about CBD or CBD oil making in the class.
So, it doesn't specifically focus on that, but all of the chemistry principles and extraction principles apply to any plant, and I definitely mention it as an example several times. The thing about, so let me just riff on that for a minute. So, and this is something I was going to say earlier too. Cannabis is not just CBD. Like this is our society at work here. We tend to zoom in on the one thing. We have tunnel vision. Oh, CBD, it's it's the thing. When actually this plant has hundreds of active constituents that work synergistically together, right? So Raphael Mechoulam, back in the 60s, Israeli researcher, he's the one who actually discovered THC and CBD, right? And he, is probably, he's still alive, actually. He knows more about this plant than any other human. And he was like, you know what? People are always talking about, well, he didn't say this, but I'm synthesizing these things here. So people are always talking about, CBD, it's the anti-inflammatory thing in cannabis. And he was like, you know what? Whole raw cannabis leaf is a stronger, is a stronger anti-inflammatory substance than any of the things that we've managed to extract from it and test separately. So right there in the 60s, in the beginning of the game, here's Dr. Mechoulam, going, it's a synergistic thing, right? Because cannabis leaf contains, not only cannabinoids, including CBD, or hemp especially is high in CBD, but, there are flavonoids and there are all kinds of anti-inflammatory flavonoids. There are terpenoids, right? There are monoterpenes, there are sesquiterpenes. There's an anti-inflammatory sesquiterpene in cannabis, right? This is part of the essential oil, that is just as strong as what they call bute, which is the pharmaceutical veterinary anti-inflammatory they use on horses, right? Race horses and show horses. Equally powerful, this molecule. There are flavonoids, there are carotenoids, oil-soluble anti-inflammatory antioxidant compounds, and it goes on and on. So it's, we've tunneled onto the CBD thing. Oh, CBD oil, we need to make CBD oil. And I'm just like, that's one way to approach it. But you know what? The plant is a lot more powerful and a lot more sophisticated, and I believe a lot more efficacious when we take into account this whole synergistic array of constituents, and when we learn how to bring those out into our medicines, right? So, and I'm always like, I don't know, Colorado, the first state to legalize recreational here, so there's all kinds of goofiness regarding extractions and presentation and what this plant can actually do and what the best way is to, utilize that. So we learn a lot of the principles that explain these sorts of things to you. And even a lot of herbalists are interested in formulating with cannabis. It's like, okay, what other herbs, can we put together with this? Treat this as a medicinal plant, right? Not as a vehicle for CBD. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like you learn the whole systematic sort of way of understanding, what is the significance of an individual molecule? What are its companion molecules? What are synergistic interactions? What do we know about how those can strengthen and enhance each other? What do we know about how to get a broad spectrum extraction of just that or a plant, things like that?
Yeah, that's great. You really touched on something there. I was just typing out. Formulating with cannabis is really, I think that's a new frontier in both the clinical side as well as product side. And people are kind of starting to get into that, but most of the people that are doing it from the cannabis side and don't really have any herbal background. So I think it's really another door for a person to walk through. And if you can do this with Lisa's class. If you can take Lisa's class, understand these concepts, these phytochemistry concepts there, believe me, applying that to cannabis is it's very, very simple. It's a very short walk to go over there and do the same thing. So.
Yeah. Yeah, because, that's why I started out earlier talking about cannabinoids, because everybody was like tunneled on the cannabinoids, And I mean, they've even made, a pharmaceutical out of them now, like Sativex is half THC, half CBD, and now we've got, a Pedialex, which is basically CBD as a pharmaceutical, FDA approved or whatever. But there's so much more going on with that plant. And I think I mentioned somewhere on the slide that it's like nettles. Like if you take the stingers out of nettles and you take the cannabinoids out of cannabis, what you have is a very similar array of constituents, which I think is interesting. So cannabis is like nettles plus.
Right.
So anything that you can say about nettles leaf, you can say about cannabis leaf as far as the array of other constituents in there. And then you have the whole terpenoids profile going on and everything. And I mean, it's just so interesting because, I don't know, like I said, like the tunnel vision on the CBD, I mean, it's a great molecule, but it's one molecule of thousands, and what is the plant up to with all those others, and how do we harmonize like what we are doing to be able to receive the gifts of those hundreds of synergistic molecules going on at the same time. So. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you, Lisa, so much. I think we're going to move on and grab Katia here. But I'm glad this worked out.
Right on.
We were able to talk. This was awesome. So wonderful to hear from you.
It's been fun.
Yes.
Okay. Well, we'll see you in the future.
Okay. Take care.